Hey guys, an incredible podcast today. Sat down with Mike Gore, who is the founder of Charitabl, and he was formerly the CEO of OpenDoors Australia that works with the persecuted church around the globe. He's a really great guy. Shared some incredible insights about his own journey. He was born as an orphan in India and then was adopted by an Australian family. We talked about that. We talked about racism. We talked about the voice referendum coming up. We talked a bit about the church and how the church can better approach discipling people. There's just so much in there. We went all over the place. I really encourage you to listen right through to the end. And also, please like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel as well, and let's help get the message out there. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons podcast. Today I have Mike Gore on the podcast with us, which I'm very excited to talk to him. Mike has recently founded Charitabl, which is an app that allows you to give to charities without a commission, and we're going to hear a bit about that. He was formerly the CEO of OpenDoors Australia, so serving the persecuted church around the globe. And Mike has a phenomenal story. When I heard this a few months ago, I thought, I've got to get him on the podcast. He was actually born in India as an orphan, adopted by an Australian family, and then ended up growing up in Sydney here in Australia. So it's great to have you on with us today, Mike. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Caleb, it's good to be here. I appreciate you having me. I always look forward to speaking to people. So it's hoping it's going to be a good episode.
Yeah, great. Mike is a great speaker. I heard him speak a few months ago in the Gold Coast, and that's where I said, mate, would you jump on the podcast with me, which he's been willing to do. So tell us a bit about your story, mate. It's just phenomenal, really mind-blowing, the journey from India all the way to Sydney. Would you mind talking us through how that all came about?
No, look, it's an interesting journey, as you said before. I mean, for the listeners, I was abandoned at birth in India. So from my understanding of it, I was found in a field by a pediatrician, actually, and now born as a Hindu. And now in India, there is what's called the caste system. And that's kind of like a social ranking of class, a hierarchical system that can either render people at the top of society or at the bottom. And unfortunately for me, the circumstances amidst which I was born, i.e. being elected in a field, put me fairly low on the agenda over there. And I was placed into an orphanage, but unable to be adopted because they believed that whatever I'd done in my previous life had determined the circumstances amidst which I had been born. So that was in 1981, Caleb. In 1977, a family in Australia with two biological daughters of their own applied for an adoption. They were a Christian family and they thought that they wanted to adopt. They had, as I said, two biological daughters of their own. But over the sort of following 4 years, they heard a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape, but nothing conclusive around adoption. So in 1981, the year that I was born, I actually decided on giving up on adopting a child. In fact, they wanted to close that chapter and move on with their lives. They spent the money they had saved on a trip to America, Disneyland, of course, with their two biological daughters as a way of kind of closing the chapter and saying, maybe that wasn't for us, and now we need to move on with our lives. Anyway, while they were away, a lady in the orphanage, a Hindu woman, took a liking to me. And one night she grabbed me and she smuggled me across a state border. She bribed some nuns with cash, literally with cash, to say and ask if they would change my birth certificate, which would allow me to be adopted under a different state's law. Wow. They agreed. And so this family got back from their trip to America. They got a phone call saying, hey, the adoption's gone through and your son will be at the airport at the weekend. And they said, no way, not a chance. I mean, we have got no money. And that night they were a Christian family, a faith-based family. That night they prayed about it. I always think to myself, man, what kind of prayers were they that night? I mean, like, were they... I'm pretty sure they weren't the kind of, nice, soft, gentle Jesus prayers. They were probably like, my gosh, we are terrified. What the hell are we going to do kind of prayers? But either way, they prayed about it. The next day, the mother was driving her car. She actually had a car crash and wrote the car off without a scratch or a bruise to anyone in the car. And she said, what was a miracle was that 2 days later, Caleb, the day before I arrived in Sydney Airport, the insurance money had been returned to her bank account. And more than that, it was to the exact dollar that was needed to pay for my adoption, not a dollar more and not a dollar
Wow.
less. And so that's how I
Wow.
ended up in Australia.
Wow. There you go. Mate, that is some story. Very different to mine. I was born around the corner here and I still live here.
Yeah.
That's incredible. How do you think that's affected you just as a man, as a person growing up? It's just, has it been a good thing, a bad thing, neutral?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things I would say, and one of the great, classic responses to when people hear that story is that they can often say, well, look, it's so different to my story. I just grew up around the corner, I was born here.
Mm.
One of the things I'm really passionate about in life is that there's actually no hierarchy in our life story. We love to, particularly in Christian circles, and I know some of the listeners here will be Christian, some not, but the reality is within church circles or, in modern day social media circles, we always
Mhm.
hero the story, but often we hierarchy or place your story above mine or my story above yours or vice versa. The reality is
Mm.
our life stories all have a purpose and an impact on people who need them at the right time. And so I'm
Yeah,
really
it's true.
passionate about saying, look, I may have been smuggled across borders. It may be a flamboyant and elaborate story that rendered me here in Australia, but actually your story has power to those who know you best. And
Yeah,
to
it's true.
not judge your story or your purpose based on someone else's story. And I know that's a bit preachy, but you see it in society and culture everywhere today that people live under the banner of not being good enough, not looking good enough, not
Mm.
earning enough. And a lot of it's to do with the fact that we too often measure ourselves horizontally. And I'd love to hear
Mm.
your story. Doesn't matter how, vanilla it is, because actually there's a purpose to it. And I'm really
Yeah.
passionate about that.
Yeah, it's true. It's a great point because people have all kinds of stories, and therefore, with someone like yourself or me, maybe who's end up on preaching or speaking on stages, people identify with all kinds of people and all kinds of backgrounds and all kinds of stories. And
Hmm.
yeah, it is a nice to have a flamboyant story, though. I do like that, and it's a nice way to introduce yourself and even to introduce you on the podcast here. So I'm interested. Like growing up in Australia, did you just feel completely Aussie then? Or was this lingering kind of desire to know more about your heritage, your background, where you came from?
No, look, I would say I 100% must see myself as Australian. In fact, I still remember walking across the playground in high school actually, and I caught my reflection in a window, and I thought to myself in that moment, bloody hell, I'm brown. And like, I just, and it seems
You
so funny for
realised,
people listening, but
yeah.
yeah, and it shouldn't actually even change the way I walk, the way I talk, or the way I see myself. But I'm just me. Right? I'm an Australian
Mm,
through and through. But that may be how I've seen myself, Caleb. It is not, however, how others have seen me. And
mm,
so, even to this day, and growing up, I grew up in the Sutherland Shire, the sort of the whitest part of Sydney, I guess you could say. I was the only brown
yeah.
skin kid in school until I was 16 when I moved away. I
Wow.
remember being in year four and walking across a playground and a girl walking over to me and saying, "Your black mother," spitting all over me. I have had
Wow.
people come into the front yard with hockey sticks to beat me up. I still to this day have racial exclusion at different times. And so,
Really? Wow.
although I may see myself as Australian, your
Mm,
question is probably best answered in the fact that there's a two-sided um, coin to that question. Is that I
mm,
may see myself as Australian, but one of the hardest reconciliations in that is that there are very few people who see me as Australian. And so, if you wanted to
mm,
dive into that, that's the identity gap, right? Is
mm,
that I've seen myself as fitting into this society and being 100% Australian, but
mm,
Australia doesn't see me that way. And then growing up, I haven't had an affinity with India whatsoever, although my adopted parents did always say, "We'll take you back to India. You just tell us when." Um, and so when I was about 18, I said, "Look, I think I'm ready to go." And for
mm.
some in some ways misplaced belief, I thought that when I would get off the plane in India, the motherland would kind of open her arms and re-embrace me as a long lost son. It was vastly different. The moment I got off the plane, my gosh, I received as much heat as I probably did in Australia because, I mean, I
Yeah.
dressed like a Westerner, I talk like a
Yeah.
Westerner, I was with two white people. And so there was a
Mm.
real challenge there that I didn't feel like I fit in Australia. I sure as
Mm.
hell thought I'd fit in India, and I didn't. And so my wrestle was, well, where do I fit in? And so
Mm.
I think that's probably the best way to answer your question. It's a two-sided coin. I see myself as Australian. At times, the wrestle is that I'm probably not seen as Australian.
Yeah. So talk to me more about that then with your identity. Like, how did you resolve that as a young man? Like, how did you find your place? How did you work out who you are?
It's a funny one. I've seen racism do two things to people. It either helps reaffirm and solidify identity, or it tears down and breaks it. And
Mm.
it can go either way. I've spent a lot of time speaking on boards for the Department of Community Services to prospective inter-country adoptive parents on things like uh, cultural assimilation, cultural assimilation, racism,
Mm.
and those kind of identity pieces. And so I've tried to walk parents through what it would be like to have a inter-country adoptee in their family. But
Mm.
for me, racism pushed me sort of to have a deeper sense of justice, of kindness, and of care. And in many ways, to be honest, I would attribute the church to helping with that
Okay.
because I grew up in the Anglican church here in Sydney, and it was a somewhat progressive Anglican church. Our minister was really, radical when it comes to Sydney Anglicanism. But
Hmm.
what I loved was that in the 80s, when I grew up, I would walk into that church on a Sunday and I would be treated as one of the Gore family. No one saw me as brown first. I would be
Yeah.
chastised by the old ladies in morning church, for climbing on roofs or throwing rocks. Like I was treated exactly the same as anyone else. And so
Hmm.
within
Amazing.
that church family and culture, I found a sense of identity that not just said I was Christian, but said I fit in the family. And
Mm.
um, and so I think for me, it's the strength and the purpose that came from being accepted as part of the family there that
Yeah.
allowed me to use racism and opposition to build me up in a stronger, more courageous kind of sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So would you say Australia is like racism is a real thing, is systemic, is deep, or would you say it's just in pockets? I mean, it's an interesting time because we're coming into this voice referendum, and some of the political or social kind of commentary around that has been that we're racist, and this is a way for us to say yes to Aboriginal people and deal with racism or reconcile the past. What's I'd be really interested. What's your opinion on racism in Australia?
I'm pretty passionate about not living at either end of scales. I think in too often in life we can make it a yes or no issue, or black or white, whereas life is best lived out of the center of a scale. I wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
say Australia is inherently racist. No, I would say there are people who are. I would also say that there are people who experience discrimination based on weight, on
Mm.
body shape, on social status, on career, on all sorts of things like that.
Yeah,
And
true.
we too often pull it to the floor because we want to make it about race, about culture, about religion. What I see is we live in a society that again wants to pigeonhole people into different boxes and categories for a variety of reasons. Race is
Mm.
one of those. And for
Mm.
me, skin tone forms part of that. But I've also seen people horrifically abused because of their wealth. You know,
Yeah.
I've seen people horrifically abused because of the shape of their body,
Hmm.
because of their personality. And so, I wouldn't say Australia is inherently racist. I would say that there are people who will always see the world differently to you. And we live in a world based on fear that often seeks to push people away and classify them
Yeah.
using, in some ways, the most hurtful elements of that to keep you at a
Hmm.
distance.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good point. So with the referendum, then, like, do you think that that's something that is going to help unify Australia against this kind of exclusion attitude, or do you see it as something that is, I mean, a waste of time? Like, what are your thoughts on it?
It's a very provocative question, to be honest. I
Mm.
think that what I would say is that no, I don't think the referendum solves those issues. Sorry, I don't think that
Hmm.
Australia will ever not be a country that's compartmentalized. I think that there is so much systemic hurt and pain on a variety of fronts, not just for Indigenous Australia, but in this particular vein with the referendum, we need to look at them and say, look, there is acknowledgement of hurt there, and but it's not a silver bullet answer. It is an
Yeah.
important step forward because I think society and culture must evolve. I look back to some of the things I was preaching 10 plus years ago as a faith believing Christian that I'd be
Mm.
mortified at believing now. I think
Mm.
society and culture evolve. I think this is an
Mm.
important step forward. I think that actually it's going to take some massaging to get right. But I think that it is fear that would stop us from progressing culture, whereas there will always be problems in culture. It's the ebb and
Mm.
flow of society. If we look at it as a silver bullet solution, then we're only going to be let down. No, this is a stepping stone in a pathway to making Australia a more inclusive, a more respectful, and a healthier nation.
Hmm. Great, great answer. I really like your nuanced approach to things, and I think seeing the world as a lot more grey, messy, different perspectives is important. And I think the Christian approach that I can hear coming through what you're saying as well, that that there is a sin problem. There's a condition. People are fallen, as we would talk about in church circles. And so, like you say, there's always going to be problems. There's always going to be challenges, hate, division, all these kind of things. And I totally agree with you with the referendum. I think possibly a step forward, but it is also not going to solve all of our problems. And I don't really like that kind of commentary where it becomes this kind of absolutist, this is the answer, this will solve the historical issues, this will solve the future. But I do tend to drift more towards the conservative side of things myself. I think that's more my personality. I just like things to stay as they are. So I don't know. I'm thinking through it and talking to people myself, which way I might go with the votes, and also want to try and help my church understand the both sides of the coin as well. I never try to say anything from the pulpit. You should vote this way or that way, or left or right, because I don't think that's helpful in the church either. So yeah.
No, I think that would be one of the great challenges that I've learned in my previous career is that I think there's a politicalization of the gospel that has become one of the great
Mm.
burdens and great um, misses of the church,
Mm.
because in an attempt to say that Australia is a Christian valued nation, never was, right? It is a church that basically tries to hold on to politics and values and moral code. And when we do that, there's an inherent problem and gap and a friction gap cause.
Yes.
I think the politicalization of the gospel is of great concern to the future of the church. Whereas I do
Mm.
think that um, in the logic you mentioned before of sin, it's one of the great, again, um, sort of points where you need to be careful as a church in what you preach, is that we need to preach both a highs and lows gospel, an inclusive gospel, again, which Christians go, well, what are you talking about? Well, what I'm talking about is the fact that the whole premise of the gospel is that there is no hierarchy in sin, and that
Mm.
Jesus judges me as filthy and clean as the next person, and that is what grace is all about. Whereas
Mm.
we live in a culture that wants to say, whether it be the referendum or others, that this is a danger and this is a concern. Well, no, I believe in a God that sees me as filthy and as clean as the next person. And so
Mm.
what matters to me most is saying that life is tough, but God is good. And
Amen.
I will open my heart, my mind, and my ears to see the world from someone else's value set. It doesn't mean I
Mm.
have to
Great.
agree with it. It doesn't mean I have to vote for it. But what I
Yeah.
do think we need to do as human beings and as Christians is be far more broadly accepting of a variety of viewpoints as opposed to trying to hold the line at either end of a scale.
Yeah, it's good. I like it. What about yourself, Mike? Where are you at in your faith journey? What's kind of your story? How did that come through from that early Anglican upbringing? You still in the Anglican church, or?
Now, look, I've had a really broad experience of church. I've gone through Anglican churches, Baptist churches, Pentecostal churches. I am not someone who gets bound by denomination. I think that in my experience in my former career, what I've learned is that, you know, the Bible talks about the road being narrow, but there is a beautiful and a variety way of walking it, right? A colorful way of walking it, and unity is what we're chasing, not uniformity. And so for me,
Yes.
I've been on a really, if I spent probably the last 12 months, if I'm honest to your listeners, Caleb, trying to run from God, and what I found is freedom in God. And that's for a variety of reasons. I think that um, there have been times where the church and the wrestles of the church and actions of Christians have left material damage to people I love and seen and heard in my world. And I question the goodness of God in the moments like that. But what I've realized is that we need to, it's what I would call the moral unlearning of the gospel. I know contentious for some people, but I think that too often in life as Christians, we use the gospel as a guillotine for others and a pillow for ourselves. And what I mean by that is that if I think back, and I'm going to choose a very provocative example, right? But if I think back to growing up, sex before marriage, right? I know several of my friends who are no longer Christians because they may had a misstep in that regard, and the way the church treated them left them feeling that they were eternally damned to hell. Yet the Bible that I read, I can't see anything about sex before marriage. Don't get me wrong. I think that you need to be mindful of it and some wisdom in doing that, and there's a lot of consequences to it. But the notion of eternal damnation, I can't find. And so there's all these moral codes that I feel like have been kind of placed into the gospel over the years that I've been a Christian that have shaped my viewpoint of the world around us, my openness to accepting a highs and lows gospel, the breadth of inclusivity, the fact that Jesus went to the cross for his love for all mankind, not just church-going Christians. And so I think that's the journey I've been on. I call it the moral unlearning of the gospel, but it's not, for those listening, it's not this deconstruct. No, it's none of that sort of stuff. What it is just saying, hey, man, I believe in a God. And I've traveled the world through the job I used to do. I have stared ISIS in the face of the height of the war with, in Iraq and Syria. I have been on lockdown in hotels for risk of kidnapping for ransom. I've seen the church under pressure in parts of the world that you would never talk about, never dream of going to. And in the middle of that, I realized that Jesus went to the cross. If we are Christians who believe what we are taught or read, he went to the cross for his love for you, me, and ISIS. I'm not saying we worship the same God. What I'm saying is no one is beyond salvation. But I have lived a faith personally. I'm not saying everyone has. I've lived a faith personally that would say there are certain people and lifestyles that lie beyond the fringes of salvation. I no longer believe that. I believe that I am as filthy and as clean as the next person, that Jesus went to the cross for everyone, and that whether, sin is sin, I always say love is love, and sin is sin. And as Christians, we must understand both. Love is love, and sin is sin.
Yeah, really good. What kind of led you to some of these questions? Like, something I think about a lot. I mean, we're similar age. I think you're older than me. I was 82, born in 82.
81.
There you go. So I'm about to turn 41 next kind of in a couple of months. So, but it's been an interesting time of life, Mike. I don't know if you've had a similar experience to me, but a lot of my friends who I grew up in church with have hit walls, in their 30s, 40s. Probably similar to yourself, I've had my own journey of questions, and I think it's an important part of being a follower of Jesus is actually being free to ask big questions and challenge our methods of doing church, our styles, our approaches, wrestle that away from what is actually primary, doctrines, as you're talking about, of the gospel and salvation and grace and these kind of things. Have you had that experience with any of your friends? Did you have anything yourself that kind of led you to this place of asking some deeper questions, or was it just, just the years and years go by and you get to this spot? I'd be interested to know your experience.
Yeah, look, I've got lots of friends who are no longer in the church. One pastor said to me recently, we're seeing Christians leave the church in order to protect their faith. I mean, Caleb, that is a terrifying statement.
Yeah, it's not good.
But it's also a real one, and something that as a church we just need to acknowledge. We don't need to fear. We don't need to try and dispel or dispute or speak against. We just need to say, hey, cool, again, remember scales, middle of the scale. For some people, that will be true. For others, it is not true. But the reality is, so what does a middle look like? How does a church? I believe the message of Jesus doesn't change, but the method of delivery must. And
Yes.
that thought of evolution for the church, or messaging, or communication, or fellowship, is often fraught with fear, because we're wanting to keep our churches going out of our best intentioned efforts to serve community. We can sometimes get caught up in focusing on the mechanics of the organization more than we are on the mission. And I think
Yes.
that's a real wrestle for the church. But I've seen it in my friendship circles. There's a big sort of shifting of church culture. And as church leaders like yourself, I think we need to not fear that. So we need to realize that people can still be a Christian and not necessarily be in church. That is not a vote to say church doesn't matter. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying if you start thinking at either end of the scale, in other words, they're not in church, they are not Christian, you must be in church to be a Christian, all you do is do this, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you could say, hey, in the middle of the scale, it's okay for this season that people aren't in church, how may we encourage them to get their foot back in the water, dip a toe in the water, come back once a year, twice a year? What services can we provide that are outside of the home that allow fellowship? Is it Bible reading groups and text message chats where you just post the fact you're reading a chapter? Like, how do we foster a sense of community living out of the middle of that scale, not at either end of it? Because if you try and go to either end or drag someone from here to there, you're often going to miss them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think fellowship is really the key, in my opinion. But you've got to work out your personal revelation of Christ, what it means to be a follower of Jesus. I think for a lot of my friends and even myself, that wasn't as formed or as mature. And then it was mixed with a lot of methodology of doing church and the mechanics, as you said before. And I think untangling that is really important. And I've had to do a bit of that. It saddens me that some people can't do that well, and they feel like all they can do is throw God away or dismiss the Bible or say that was just my upbringing and my parents did that to me. That's sad, because I think it's just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But I think if you can untangle that and go, well, I really believe that God is true. I believe that Jesus, the Son of God, rose from the dead. And I believe that following him is living a life of purpose and meaning. And then the next step is, what does fellowship look like? Because to grow, you need others. Christianity is not an individual spiritual journey. As much as there is an independence, so we stand before God alone. To grow in our faith requires others. So what does fellowship look like? And I think that's the big question. And you're right, fellowship doesn't look like the way the Baptists do it only. It doesn't look like the Catholic Church only. It doesn't look like the kind of emerging home church, get away from institutional organized Sunday worship services. We should just be following Jesus all the time in our lounge rooms and praying. And, they all have truths and they're all great approaches, but they're also different approaches. And I think the time we live in, Mike, I'm interested to hear your thoughts, is really interesting, because there is quite a broad spectrum. And I suppose culturally we live in a time where people are all about options and about the freedom to choose, and no one's really interested in following some traditional denomination for 70 years of their life anymore. So that's a real challenge for me as a pastor, because I think what we're doing is great, of course, because I'm completely subjective to my own church. But it is something that we've had to wrestle through with our leadership team at the church. Like, how do we, not trip over styles and methods, and how do we maybe even have a broader approach to helping people follow Jesus? The challenge of kids playing sport on weekends is hard, because people can't go to church if they put the sport before church. And there's just so many different things. People are camping every second weekend these days. Like, after COVID, like, people have just jumped churches and switched churches and moved states. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot tied up in how we measure success as church leaders. And I think historically we measure that by bums on seats or numbers in our churches. I actually think that discipleship is of far greater importance to the church than evangelism. I think it has been and should have been that way for many years. And when I talk about that, I I refer to discipleship of what I call lifers, multi-decade serving Christians. Too often we go,
Mm-hmm.
get someone in, try and get them to become a Christian, and then get them into a discipleship group. I actually think the best evangelism happens out of the overflow of a courageously confident relationship in Christ. And where the church needs to focus its attention on the next season is around discipleship. How are you discipling people in a decentralized fashion? Because there's a lot of fear, even off the back of COVID and other things, of central communities and communications
Yes.
and environments. There's a huge spike in things that we're not talking about around mental health, social anxiety, and all of these things that are residual from COVID. But we think we want life to be back to normal. I'm convinced it is, but we're forgetting the outliers, right? And because of that, we start almost writing our own narrative and a self-fulfilling prophecy that says,
Mm.
hey, numbers are going down, this is getting harder, people are camping, people are exploiting. They're all true. But we need to come back to the core tenets of what we're doing, discipleship over evangelism. How do you disciple people in a decentralized world? The work world has done that. Everyone works from home now. So if we take the same logic and say, how do you do that in a church setting? That's where true innovation happens for me, is because you're saying as a church leader, hey, let's parallel what's happening in the wider world when it comes to employment, work, decentralization, working from home. What is, making it up as I go, but what does church from home look like? And that's not a house church, but it's that same logic of going, hey, your faith is now predominantly outworked in the home, and people get to choose if they come to church or stay at home. What is our church from home or work from home program look like?
Yeah, it's good. It's kind of church on demand, isn't it? Discipleship on demand. Like there has to be that freedom to pick it up when we make space or to schedule it
Yeah,
in a flexible way.
and not mislabeling people. We often in the church can say they're fallen out of faith. No, people are falling out of a lifestyle of faith. But unless they start preaching an anti-message, they're still in faith. We need to just get
Mm,
better at trusting the journey.
mm, mm,
Because again, we use language that is somewhat unhelpful in sort of saying if you're no longer at church, well, maybe they're no longer a Christian, they've kind of fallen out of faith.
mm,
Well, no, they may have simply fallen out of a lifestyle of faith. It doesn't mean they don't pray, they don't cry out to God, they don't
mm,
attune their thoughts to Him and think on Him throughout the day. It doesn't mean they are actively saying, He is not the Son of God and He didn't die for me. They're just no
mm.
longer in a habit and lifestyle of faith. And too often we have used that as exclusionary language that says, hey, well, because of that, they mustn't be a Christian anymore.
Yeah,
Again, that's
yeah.
one of the lessons I'm learning is that that's not true at all, man. You
So
can
black and
have
white.
fallen out of the
Yeah,
lifestyle of faith, but still be a passionate Christian.
yeah, it's great. And I've definitely taken on board some lessons there as a pastor, really, rather than think through, people's maybe issues or try to judge their faith, as you're saying there. Really think about, well, how as a church can we better respond to that? How as we as pastors can we preach better, disciple better, run churches that are more accessible, so that when people do want to grow and do want to learn and do want fellowship, that's easily accessible. And it's actually thinking away. I think it's a lot of it for me the last few years has been learning how to change the methods and innovate. Not how to hold on to what we did before that worked or the past, that worked. So, but for you, Mike, like what's kind of the next step in your journey? Would you be comfortable sharing? You said you've had this season of wrestling and looking at some things. You've obviously got some really well thought through um, opinions about the church or faith and where it is at the moment in our Aussie culture. Like, what's kind of the next step for you?
I just think just trust the journey. Be kind to yourself and trust the journey. I think that, I'm not anti-church at all. In fact, I need to be very clear. I think the church is an unbelievably good institution within
Mm,
society and culture and much needed for the future of faith. I think that having a more broadly accepting um, lens on faith for me, in many ways, I got it from my parents, Caleb. They are quite progressive in their viewpoint. Um,
mm,
and I'm only realizing that now at 42, just like how progressive they were and
mm,
how it shaped my belief over the years. But and I'm good. I'm just like, I still love God. I love people, love building something out of nothing. That's going to get me out
mm,
of bed every day of the week. But I
mm,
am far more open to the empathetic lens on, even things. Again, we sort of we hit sex before marriage. Well, let's hit divorce for a minute.
mm.
I've seen lots of divorce happening within the Christian world. I know of a lot that may happen. And
Mm,
what I've learned is that in the middle of that, historically, I would have judged it um, on a variety of things. Whereas now I'm like, man, I've never walked in their shoes. Who am I to judge?
mm,
I don't
mm,
know what their situation is. What I am going to say is that, hey, that must have been a really courageous and hard decision, and I love you. I support both of
mm,
you. Um,
mm,
I'm not going to say things like I'm sorry because actually it may not be an issue of sorry. It could be an issue of abuse or domestic
mm,
violence.
mm,
Um, but historically, and a good friend of mine is a police prosecutor, a Christian, but works predominantly in DV, and will say, well, one of the biggest challenges for Christians is they often stay too long in abusive situations.
mm.
And
Yeah.
so by taking on all these viewpoints and kind of marrying it with where society and culture is going,
Mm.
I want to have a faith that is far more empathetic and
Great.
far more open-handed in
Yeah.
realizing that again, God sees me as filthy and clean as the next person, and
Mm.
because of that, I am not going to place a hierarchy. Billy Graham said, "At the foot of the cross, the ground is level," and um, and that's the kind
It's
of faith
great.
that I want to live.
Yeah, it's great. It's fantastic. So tell us a little bit about Charitabl. So you've founded this app and this giving platform. As I understand it, this is pretty new. Only last year, maybe you got this off the ground.
Actually, it's only been live now since the 1st of May, so it's been a
Oh
couple of
wow.
years in the making, but it's basically like the Uber Eats of giving. I
Hmm.
thought in the charity I used to run, people would often ask me to build an app, but I am a firm believer that for the cost involved, it's an abject waste of money and stewardship of generous donations to build your
Mm.
own app for your own company. So
Mm.
I decided with a friend of mine to sort of self-fund it and build it ourselves, but build what we would, yeah, the best way to describe it, the Uber Eats of giving. So you can, find 39,000 of Australia's registered charities, not-for-profits, churches, schools on this
Wow.
app. You can register once, get an annual giving statement. You can find all of, sort of like the charities you like, so they're right there, easy to recall. And
Hmm.
all of a sudden, it's basically taking a lot of the barriers out of giving, and
Hmm.
it's commission free. So anyone listening, man, go and download it. You can give. The only fee would be a Stripe fee that it's going to take anyway, but the rest of that goes to the charity. But what
Hmm.
we want to do is try and keep it going by sharing the cost of technology amongst the 39,000 charities. Because instead
Hmm.
of us all paying $250,000 to build our own app, what if we all just paid $200 to keep it going? And
Yep.
um, and so that's our dream, is that if we can make it easier for people from all walks of life to be kind, then actually we can increase generosity in Australia. We can reduce the administrative costs of charities. We can increase the impact of every dollar raised, all the while giving people like you and I choice, because we love like Uber Eats and we love LinkedIn and we love Amazon and the iconic. We want choice. We want
Yep.
convenience. We want a sense of community, a purpose greater than ourselves. We want to be in control of our giving in a world where um, scams, and
Mm.
misleading text messages are making us a bit nervous. And we want the
Yep.
confidence that is secure. And so we built this thing called Charitabl. And my sneaking suspicion is if we can hold on long enough, it is going to change the game when it comes to giving.
Fantastic. Wow, that's fantastic. And what's the take up been like so far in the first, I suppose, six months or 5 months?
Yeah, so we are now at 650 odd users. We haven't really done any public marketing yet. That's coming. We
Hmm.
have pushed well over $40,000 of donations through to charities, and we
Great.
have users ranging from 76 years of age down to sort of 16, and
Hmm.
now have got about 15 subscribed charities on premium things, premium platforms and subscriptions using the app. So, from all intents and purpose, with no kind of public marketing, the measurements are promising. But
Hmm.
again,
Great.
for anyone watching this in business, they know some days feels like you're soaring, other days it feels like a splat. Um, it'll go either way, but I do believe if people download it and give once, I promise you'll never give any other way again, because it
Yeah,
is
yeah,
so easy and such a cheap way of giving.
great. Yeah, we'll make sure we push it out to everyone that we
Yeah,
know
thank you.
off the back of this podcast. I think that just sounds fantastic. And what's it like start with doing a startup like this, building an app? Like, what was the journey like for you? Have you had to leave security of work or career or wages to be able to do this, or like I'm just interested in the behind the scenes of taking on a project like this.
Yeah, it's cost me a lot, not just financially. I had to give up a career that I was had been in for 12 years, was well paid in and good at. But there are times where you've got to jump into what you believe is the future. And so, we're 12 months on from that journey now, still haven't earned a cent, put it all, living off savings, putting it all
Yeah.
into the business and the idea, because again,
Wow.
if you believe in it, you just got to chase it, I think. And it will
Yeah.
go either
Wow.
way. So, as I said, man, it is, you lose sleep. It is terrifying. You wonder how you're going to pay, for your mortgage. Um, but you also need every now and then in life to just take a jump, take a leap. And if you can believe and see, I always say there are people who can see big. There are people who can dream big. There are very few people who can see big, and there are only a handful full of people who can build big. And I think
Yeah.
if you can do all three of those, then we've got a big chance that this sucker's going to work. But I'll tell you
Mm.
what, the startup journey is terrifying.
Yeah. No, it must be full on, mate. Well done to you and whoever else is supporting you, and I'm sure your wife is, because yeah, it sounds like a big risk, and yeah, but I think you're right. You got to believe in something, and if you want to live a life that's an adventure, it takes faith, believing in something, going for something, jumping at stuff.
Hmm.
So well done, mate. It takes a lot of guts. So,
Yeah, thanks.
um, what do you think about giving in Australia? And how generous are Australians? Like, I'm sure you have a bit of an understanding of the statistics, or where do we rank as a nation? Are Australians generous in their giving? Do we support our charities well?
Look, historically, and if you looked at the data, they would say that Australia is relatively not generous. Um,
Hmm.
I don't agree with that. I think Australia is incredibly generous, but predominantly generous towards things that happen domestically. So
Mm.
bushfires, floods, other natural disasters. Australians are really, really good at helping Australians. We
Okay.
could probably get better in helping overseas, but I think again, too often we will say we are generous or we're not. I think for the most part, Australians are incredibly generous. Um,
Hmm.
but the thing that seems to be of most appeal to us as Australians is domestic issues. And so um, that's where I've seen the generosity side of Australia.
Oh, that's really interesting. So I wouldn't have, yeah, I wouldn't have understood that. Being in a pastor, being in a church, like a lot of what you deal with, as I'm sure you're aware, is money and giving and being generous. And we support a couple of missionaries overseas in the Middle East and places like that. And yeah, but I am amazed at times, just the generosity of people. And sometimes I have the privilege of knowing, how much people actually give. And it always amazes me, the generosity, young
Mm,
families with all their bills and kids just giving, incredible money, trusting that it's going to go where we said it would go, and go to, a mission, an idea, a group that we said it would go to, and that there was something will happen. And yeah, I think that's amazing. Something I talk about a bit with my church the last couple of years, especially, has been materialism, consumerism, especially how those things affect the spiritual life. The wanting and the workaholism, and then the buying and the shopping online, and just the constant need for the bigger holiday and the bigger TV and the next entertainment experience or whatever. I'm interested to see if you've got any thoughts on that, because you're trying to help people be generous with their money, but we're very much educated in our culture to gain as much money for ourselves as possible to make our lives better. Do you see a conflict there?
yeah, look, I think that if we can remove the barriers to generosity, then hopefully it will increase. I think if you make it easier for people to give, not only will they give
Hmm.
more, but they'll give more often. And that's the goal, is that it doesn't actually take much to make a difference in the world. And if Australians can become inherently, make it inherently easier for them to give, well, even if it's $10, but all of a sudden a million people are giving $10, then that really moves the needle on giving. When you
Mm.
talk about faith, I think in the Christian culture, the church and Christians are generally um, more generous than the wider populations, because we almost see it as a tenet of our faith: generosity,
Yes,
kindness,
it's a
tithing,
spiritual
giving.
practice. Yeah.
Correct. What I would say is, in the 12 years I spent working in the Christian not for profit world, I would say that we saw consumerism emerge as a far greater threat to the church than communism ever was. And that
Mm.
I would also believe that I've seen a lot of people survive persecution, but very few prosperity.
That's interesting. Can you elaborate on that? People surviving persecution more than surviving prosperity?
I think that too often in life, the gospel becomes smothered by the noise around us. And so prosperity, wealth, um,
Mm,
status, esteem, they can often be things that suffocate the expression of faith. And in my experience, it's the non-violent elements of persecution that are far more effective at suppressing the gospel than the violent ones.
mm,
Violence generally elicits a response of courage, of courage, um, of belief, self-belief, togetherness, unity. Although the non-violent ones suffocate, they smother, they
mm,
suppress, they
mm,
extinguish. And I think wealth can do that. Wealth is a
mm,
great distraction in life. Wealth, and to be very, very clear, you can be a Christian and you can be wealthy. Too often we preach an opposite message that says it's almost like a vow of poverty to be an authentic Christian.
mm,
I don't believe that.
mm.
It's about what you do with that wealth that matters, right? And
Yes.
so it doesn't mean that you can't live a nice lifestyle, drive a nice car, have a nice house. It's about giving is rarely about um, how much you keep. It's about or how much you give. It's about how much you keep, really. Um,
Yes.
because for what purpose are you keeping it? It doesn't matter the dollar figure by which you give, but like for what purpose are you keeping it?
Mm. Yeah, I really like that. I really like that, having a purpose for your wealth, because it's very, or basically impossible to say to an Australian, like, you shouldn't, have money, or you should live some kind of monastic lifestyle and take a vow of poverty, because we're just so wealthy. Like, and it's so part of our culture, it's hard for us to even understand the levels of wealth we live in. I mean, we're some of the wealthiest people that have lived in human history. Like, it's just mind blowing. But it is relative as well, because it's the money you're earning and the culture you live in. I really like your point there, Mike. It's not necessarily about not being wealthy, but it's about what you do with it, how you steward it. I think the challenge for Christians is more about, well, how much of it could you give away? Could you grow that spiritual practice, to get to 10, 15, 20%? Because you're still 80% is plenty to live off in Australia for most people. I think, I say to my church, like, most of us have houses that are worth over $1 million, which
Mm.
is nice. But what do you do with it? Do you ever invite anyone over for dinner, or is it just your $1 million castle you live in? Or do you use it, to serve people and to serve neighbours? Because then I think it doesn't matter how much your house is worth if you're using it for others. That's the point, not to try and
Yeah,
live in a little house that's not worth much. That's not the aim, but to actually use what God has given you to open your doors for others. I think is a powerful thing. So
yeah,
it's great, mate. I
absolutely.
really
And
like it.
well, it's really important as well as why we built Charitabl was that we can easily ask people in our churches or community groups to be more generous, but there is a massive link, Caleb, to making sure that the recipients of that generosity are using it as well and efficiently as possible. Because it's one thing
Mm,
to say be more generous, but if there are question marks over how it's being used, then that is also a bit of a buffer and a roadblock to
for
generosity. And
sure.
so by sharing the costs of technology or creating Charitabl, our hope was to reduce some of those costs, reduce
Mm,
the mistrust or the fear around equitable use of generosity. And if we can do that by centralizing and sharing costs, then actually, when you do challenge people to give, then they can hopefully have an additional layer of confidence to go, and you know what, it's going to make an impact because we're efficient in what
love
we
it.
do. As organizations, we operate efficiently and we move the needle on the project work that we do.
I love it. It's good. You're selling it, mate. It's really good. I think you're all over it. You're selling it to me. I'll definitely. I've already downloaded it, obviously, because I prepared myself for this podcast.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll make sure I get onto that. Maybe as we bring this thing to land a little bit, just quickly, you've talked about prosperity, charity giving. Talk to me about persecution and your former role as the CEO of OpenDoors Australia, incredible organisation serving the church globally, I believe, and serving persecuted Christians. I've just come back from Egypt and Turkey and a trip around there. We support missionaries in that region, and everything we did was fairly underground and not posting on social media. And they live with the threat of every day of being deported. They're not there, obviously, saying that they are missionaries. So, seen a little bit of it. I was about 15 kilometres from the Syrian border. a few weeks ago, looking at the earthquake zone down there in southern Turkey and the giant earthquakes this year. But nothing like, I'm sure, what you've experienced, mate. Tell us a little bit about what that was like serving a persecuted church.
Yeah, look, it was a really, I look back on that season quite fondly actually, and there was a lot of great opportunity to see, and meet beautiful people the world over that live under incredibly harsh circumstances, not
Mm,
just because of their faith, but sometimes because of issues of war or, ingrained um, economic problems within countries. But
hmm
watching people who share the same faith and the same God as you and I, but wake up with a heart to serve community was an incredibly inspiring chapter of life. And so,
Yeah, well,
I learned a lot of lessons around faith and contextualizing faith and trying to reshape it and repurpose it in a way that allowed it um, to kind of land here in Australia. It can be a very difficult thing to
mm,
land, persecution and the notion of a highs and lows gospel. But,
yeah,
I look back on those 12 years that I spent with the organization um, and realize that it shaped me into a leader
mm,
that was effective and that I was proud of. And
mm,
it also gave me an empathetic heart for a more broad understanding of the gospel.
yeah,
Whether
it would.
you draw near to God through iconism or, kissing a rock or touching a stone, or whether you use worship, and a guitar solo to do it, I realize that actually we too often put these hierarchies in faith that says one is right or the other is wrong.
Mm,
No, no.
mm,
If it facilitates a deepening of your faith, and I actually don't care how you engage with it, what matters
mm,
is that you're engaging with God through a vessel of some language that allows you to do that. So think
yeah,
about Indigenous culture for a minute, dream time, story time, all those kind of things. The way they engage with the message of Christ is actually
mm,
unbelievably beautiful,
mm,
creative, deep, and it is vastly different at the same time to a white Westerner who grew up, or not white anyway, a Westerner who grew up in the Anglican church, not even a Westerner, South Asian person who's now living in the West, grew up in an Anglican church.
yeah,
The way they engage with the gospel, but
yeah, it's
it's
very
not an issue
different.
of right or wrong. It's an issue of right and right.
Yeah. And just give us a picture, like what's it like for a persecuted Christian who's a minority group in say the Middle East or a country where Christianity is outlawed? Like, what's it like for them every day? Like, are they facing this persecution every day? Does it come in waves? Is it does it affect them daily as far as their ability to progress in their careers and things like that? Well, what's it like? 'Cause a lot of people are quite naive to the plight of
Hmm.
Christians in other parts of the world. We think we're persecuted here, which is really laughable.
Yeah, well, look, yes to both, really, is that it comes in waves. There are seasonalities of persecution. So, for instance, one of the great misnomers in the Middle East, or one of the great divisive points in the Middle East, is that Jesus rose from the dead. And so
Mm,
you can imagine Easter is an increased time of persecution. We've seen that with the Lahore bombing in Pakistan over the years, attacks in Kenya and other places like that. So there are seasonal waves of persecution. Christmas in the Middle East, for Christians listening to this, is often a really solemn time. Why? Because for anyone who wasn't a Christian, and it may be 2,000 years ago, but Christmas signifies a night where 2,000 firstborn babies were killed brutally,
mm,
innocent, right? In pursuit of one. And so you come forward, and whether you're Christian, Muslim, Yazidi, or any other faith base there, Christmas is not a time of Santa Claus and Christmas tree.
mm,
Generationally, it's a time of deep hurt and loss and lament
mm,
of a generation of boys that were wiped out in pursuit of one. So there are
mm,
waves of seasonality of persecution. Similarly, there are everyday consequences of persecution where it does affect, um, on your identity card, you need to state in certain countries what your religion is. And because
mm,
of that, you will be excluded from different job opportunities. One believer in Asia described it as civil death, a fate worse than death, where they said you're
yeah,
alive, but you're rendered dead. You can't get access to medical. You can't get jobs. If you call an ambulance, it doesn't come. All because on your identity card, it says you're a Christian. So
wow,
persecution has a daily impact. But the only thing I
mm,
would challenge you on, Caleb, is that I think persecution does exist in Australia. The misnomer is that we say it must be violent. No, no, no.
mm,
Particularly in Melbourne, I mean, where you're based, Victoria, you just try standing on any street corner and talking about Christ, and you will experience a form of persecution. The biggest wrestle for us as Christians in the West, and where we get it wrong, in my view, and in what I've learned of more than a decade working in the space, is that what I see around society and culture is Christians in the West chase persecution more than they do Jesus. What I mean by that is we say needlessly inflammatory or provocative things looking to elicit a response from society and culture so we can throw our hands in the air and say we're being persecuted. Whereas in the nations that I've worked in, people first and foremost chase a relationship with Christ, an expression of his love to community, and out of the overflow of that, persecution would come. In Western cultures, persecution exists, but we often antagonize it by chasing persecution more than we do Christ.
Yeah, it's a great point. I'm always challenged by Paul's statement to live a quiet and peaceful life, as much as it depends on you. And I think that you have to do that a lot more in a country where there's more systemic persecution. And you're right, in Australia, we should be focusing on Christ and living a peaceful life and trying to reach those who are open to the gospel, not jumping on social media and saying stupid things. I think there's a sense of like, if I can antagonize and get a reaction, for some people that gives them a sense of being a faithful Christian. So the motive's really wrong. It's trying to almost pump oneself up or affirm one's own faith by going, I am persecuted because, see, I just, got out my Bible and was just reading it and, someone didn't like it. And, wow, I'm so spiritual, I'm so faithful. And but I think as you grow and get to know God more, you just realize none of that stuff matters. God just wants to talk to you. He wants to have a relationship with you. And if there's an opportunity, he wants you to help someone, but you also don't need to go forcing it, rushing around.
That's right.
There's a lot to learn there. I think that's a great point, Mike. So I appreciate that. As we finish, do you have a leadership lesson for us, mate? If there's something over the years of working with OpenDoors and all the different bits and pieces you've done, is there some great lesson that you have learned, maybe for an aspiring leader, a young leader that's coming up? What would you say?
Yeah, look, I think if I was to call anything out, what I would talk about is value contribution and self-belief. When people know where and how they add value, they believe in themselves. So your job as a leader, it is not to be better than the people you lead, it is to get the best out of the people you lead. And so my job as CEO for 7 years was simply to put people in positions of where they could add value and then reinforce it through specific encouragement. And so, because the thing is, Caleb, man, when you believe in yourself at work, your home life changes, your spiritual life changes, your family life, like it all changes. And so our job as a leader is, again, it is not to be better than the people you lead. Don't worry about that. Just try and get the best out of them. And when it comes to encouragement, you make it specific. So instead of the cursory, hey man, you're doing a great job, you might want to say something like, hey, when you did X, Y, or Z, it contributed to the overall vision of what we're doing because we're trying to achieve this. And I want to say, I'm hugely thankful for your input and your sacrifice, because without your contribution in this regard, hitting our vision of this would be much more difficult. Again, identify where and how they add value, reinforce it through specific encouragement, because when people understand where they add value, they believe in themselves. And I think that's foundational to great leadership.
Love it. Definitely agree. I really appreciate you spending some time with us today, Mike. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Man, anytime. I've really loved it. And please, if you're a listener, man, I would love you to jump on and download Charitabl. You can find it on Google Play or the App Store. I promise you. And in fact, I dare you, give once. Because if you give once, you'll give twice, and then you'll never give any other way again. So please, check it out and get behind it. Man, it is high and low at the moment, but I believe it will change the world.
Great. Love it. And we'll push it out to all our people as well. So appreciate your time.
Thank you.
I trust you were impacted by that Leadership Lessons podcast. I would love to hear your thoughts about today's podcast. Please comment down below and please review the podcast and share it with a friend. Doing this inspires us and helps others to find the podcast. See you next time.